Welcome to Crossroads and Cauldrons. We are two witches with jobs, families, and busy lives just like you. We talk about weaving the web of community, practicing magic, and life in the Deep South. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. You're listening to Crossroads and Cauldrons podcast. I'm Selena, and I have an incredible guest for you today. I'm so pleased to bring to the show Mhara Starling. She's written a book called, I've got the full title here, Welsh Witchcraft, A Guide to Spirits, Lore, and Magic of Wales. Isn't it beautiful? It's beautiful. And so I'm very, very excited to speak with her. She was born in North Wales, raised on the Isle of Anglesey, and she's a native Welsh speaker. I'm so excited to have you here. Welcome to the show, Mhara. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you doing today? And thank you for having me on as well.
Oh, no, I'm so excited that you're here. It's funny, I was reading your book, and I had a friend visiting, and we were just chatting, and I was like, I'm reading this great book. You're going to love it. And I started talking about it, and she was like, wait a minute, is it Welsh Witchcraft? Is that what you're reading? And she was reading the same one, and she was going to tell me all about it. So I thought it was just excellent that we were both reading that at the same time.
Oh,
so I asked her if she had any particular questions for me to ask you. And she was saying nothing in particular, but she's very interested in the witch's devil. So maybe that will come up later. I don't know. But first, before we go off too far, tell us a little bit about your book. Welsh Witchcraft is so rooted in the traditions and the folklore of the land that you grew up on. So can you tell us what it was like growing up in Wales?
Absolutely. I love talking about Wales. As you can tell, I wrote a whole book on it.
You wrote a whole book.
But I grew up in a really rural area, so I had a really privileged, I think, background in that I grew up in a very rural, back of the woods kind of area. It was on the coast, so I grew up in this beautiful landscape surrounded by the sea and the woods and the fields, and my entire playground growing up was this just immense nothingness, just nature, and it was absolutely beautiful. And back then I hated it. Back when I was young, I used to be like, I want to live in a city where there's like, shops and cafes and things to do. But now looking back, I'm like, I was so lucky to have just the ability to roam free. I speak to people my age now, and I'm like, they talk about how when they were young, they weren't even allowed, to go past their street without like their parents' permission and stuff. And I was like, I could travel for miles along the coastline, and my parents did not care because we lived in such a tight-knit community that everybody knew everybody and everybody was looking out for each other. And it was also a Welsh-speaking community. So we all spoke Welsh as our first language, and Welsh was the language that I grew up with the most. And I didn't really start speaking English fully until probably like third year of high school when I started taking English at a higher level. And so my English was terrible for so long. And I look back now, I've got some videos on social media where I speak English and I'm like, oh my goodness, my accent. It's quite strange looking back and reflecting. But I was always surrounded by magic as well. And magic was a core aspect of my upbringing. Not in like I wasn't raised by witches or anything, but magic was just intrinsically part of the culture that we grew up in. So I remember I went to school with, so we only had 26 students in the whole school, and it was all very kind of like we were like siblings together. And the teachers didn't really follow a curriculum. They just did whatever they wanted with us. And so they took that opportunity because there were so few of us and we were all just bundled up together in this one room. We weren't separated by like year groups or classrooms or anything. It was just all together. They would take us on trips to the countryside where we would talk about like, oh, this is the myth of Branwen. So Branwen was a princess who lived in Harlech, and she had a brother called Bendigeidfran who was a giant. And then one day she got married to the Irish king. And this spot that we're at right here is exactly where she got married. Or they'd take us on a trip to like a woods in the middle of nowhere, and they'd be like, so this woodland leads to a little island on the coast as well. And that island is associated with Dwynwen, the patron saint of love, and she was so surrounded by magic and by love, and she has quite a tragic story, and that mythology is rooted in this place right here. And that's what I remember the most from growing up, was just how rooted the mythology that we grew up with was, and the folklore as well. It wasn't just, like these are bedtime stories of things happening long, long ago in realms far away. It was here. It was the land that I lived on. And I could like go out into the field behind my house and imagine like the Tylwyth Teg, the fairies, or the wizards and witches and princesses and giants from our folklore and mythology coming to life. And I just absolutely loved it. So there's absolutely no wonder that I ended up walking down a more kind of witchy, magical path as I grew older. And I was fortunate enough to find amazing mentors, amazing people who guided me on the path and steered me towards a spirituality that was more Welsh in nature. Because when I first started, I was very much more interested in like Wicca and the idea of neo-paganism and such. And I was very much into like gods and goddesses from Greek myth or Egyptian myth. And then I met people like Christopher Hughes, who is the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, and he introduced me to the gods of Wales. And I was like, I know these characters because we learned about them in school, and I never thought about them as gods. And then I met another mentor called Julie, who was a witch, and she taught me the importance of going out into the country itself and, not being, as she would say, not being a carpet witch, not doing everything on the floor of your apartment, and instead going out into the woods and things. And she was amazing. And yeah, so I was really privileged to have all that. And when the time came that I said to Christopher, I really want to write a book, he was like, you need to do it, and you need to write it like now and get it out there. And that all culminated in this.
I'm so glad you did. And I love Christopher Hughes, by the way. Just, he's so incredible. It's interesting. You've brought me right into our next question, which is about working with the land and having ancestral ties to that land and the folklore and all of those things. Like when I was little, those were the kinds of stories that I would read about. But, I'm in America. So it was like, it was that distant land, and that sort of yearning for, how do I have that connection with where I am? Tell me about that. Tell me about when you started to recognize the land that you live on beyond story and myth, and start to see the sort of living consciousness that is there to work with. What was that like for you?
I remember when I was quite young. So I came into witchcraft and magic at quite a young age. I think I started practicing when I was about 12. At first, it was just a case of I found a book in a charity shop, a secondhand shop, which was all like this little spell book for teenagers. And I fell in love with it, and I'd do a lot of the little rituals and spells that were found in that. But then eventually, after I found Chris and the Druids and Julie, my witchcraft evolved to be more focused on the land and the place that I'm from. And I remember I was surrounded by so much historical landmarks, so much like ancient landmarks that were rooted in the land. Like just down the road from me, a short drive to like almost the next village, there was this burial chamber in between us called Bad Clotia de Gaures. And there's a whole folklore surrounding how Bad Clotia de Gaures was even created. And it's this beautiful burial chamber, which is like, it looks like a hill, but the hill is hollow. So you can go inside and there's this structure of stones, and it's absolutely ancient. It's about 2,000 or 3,000 years old. And there were so many like little signposts on the beach nearby explaining like the history and the significance of this place. And it's basically just as impressive, I think, as like Stonehenge or anything like that. And it's from the same kind of period. And we had those kind of structures all over. And I remember like growing up, those structures were just part of the landscape. We called it the Teletubby house every time we passed it, because it looked like just a hill with like a hollowness inside it. And when I finally like came to terms with the idea that, oh my gosh, there's more to my land than just the myths and stories, it's something that I can sink deeply into and connect to. That was one of the first places that I felt that I really felt that connection, was going to these ancient places. So there's like Bad Clodia de Gaures, which has a whole folklore about this giantess. So the term Bad Clodia de Gaures means the giantess's apronful. And there's this story that a giant was walking with rocks all in her apron, and then she tripped, and the rocks created this structure, and that's what created Bad Clodia de Gaures. But in reality, it's like a burial chamber and a ritual site. And then we also have like Bryn Cyhyddu and Trefignath and so much on the Isle of Anglesey, of these beautiful structures. And I remember going as like a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, like walking to these places with like my friends or my loved ones and connecting to the stones and connecting to the land and feeling so aligned with something more than myself, more than what I could see there in the moment, and thinking to myself, I think I had a bit of an existential crisis at like 14 because I realized like, oh my goodness, this structure has stood here for 2,000 years, and so many people, like people that might be my ancestors, people that might have traveled from far off into like Europe and such, have traveled to this place to see these stones, to bury their loved ones, to celebrate with people, all sorts of events. And we don't really know what these structures were for, and there's a mystery to them. And I had this like, oh my gosh, this is intense. There's so much. But then at the same time, it was just a case of connecting to what was there locally. So I talk in the book about, there was this one occasion that really stands out to me where I remember going to Julie's house. She was the typical like little village witch. She lived in a little cottage just on the outskirts of the village. And I had to walk, like, even though it was a tiny village, I had to walk about 20 minutes to get to her house out of the village through these little like side roads and back roads. And then you'd get to her little cottage. And I sat down one day with her, and it was near the winter solstice. And I remember saying to her, my little like 15 or 16-year-old self, I remember going, oh, I really want to do this ritual like on the day of the solstice, but my mum refuses to take me to the supermarket to buy these herbs that I want. And then she was like, Julie looked at me and went, which herbs do you need? And I was like, oh, I've got a list. I showed her the list, and she went, you do realize every single one of those herbs grows along the coastal path. Go and pick them, go and dry them, you have them. You should not make excuses when you can work in the land rather than going to the supermarket. And I remember that at like 15 or 16 really struck a chord within me. I was like, oh my gosh, I guess you're right. Like, I don't have to like go to the supermarket. It might be easier, but I do have it right here at my fingertips, so I don't need to do this. And ever since then, a lot of my practice has been really rooted in like, what is around me, what is right here, and what is accessible to me here and now. Which spirits live here? What did my ancestors do in this land? Like, what did the people who used to live here do? And even today, like, I've moved now to a city called Chester, which is just on the outskirts of Wales. And even today, I connect to what's going on here. So even though I see myself as first and foremost a Welsh witch who works with like Welsh Celtic deities and such, I live now in a Roman walled city. So I make the effort to learn about the Roman deities that were worshipped here, to make the effort to learn about the structures and the ancient sites that are here, and also to be rooted in the here and now as well, like what's going on now in this moment, in this place, what kind of movements are going on, and just being part of the community as a whole. And that to me is all about working with the land. So I try and bring that into my practice, and I hope that I've echoed it in the book as well.
Oh, I think you definitely have. The just reading the book and not, obviously I'm not part of the culture, so I don't have. I have the logical, like I know that I know the stories. I've read the Mabinogi, like all of that. I have it in here, but it's different. I'm sure when you grow up, sort of steeped in the magic of that place. And the beautiful thing about the language, you mentioned before, the language, like the language itself is so beautiful and poetic. How do you feel that the Welsh language has influenced your practice?
Oh, so the language to me has always been a connecting force. So I remember growing up, and this might sound really cringy, and we have to like remember that this came from the mouth of like a grandfather. But I remember someone said to me once, we were talking when I was younger about things like quite big issues like racism and prejudice. And I remember there was this old man who lived in my village who said to me once, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, doesn't matter where you come from, if you speak Welsh, you're my friend. And I was like, oh, that's a nice sentiment to have, I suppose. And I was like, that's the way we've always viewed it as well. Like, even though there are some problems nowadays and a lot of prejudice nowadays that I've spotted in like the Welsh communities, what I tend to notice is the only thing that seems to like bring us together is language and culture. culture in the land that I grew up in. And I loved that. I loved that feeling of like oneness, like we have something special. And growing up as well in a Welsh speaking community where everyone spoke the language, it was almost like our little like secret language, because
Mhm.
my mum growing up, she dealt with a lot of like anxiety problems, and so we didn't go shopping like locally in Wales. We used to always get in the car and go miles and miles away because she did not want to talk to anyone. And it always felt like I always felt really special when I was walking around the cities in Cheshire or like in Lancashire or something, and we were speaking Welsh to each other as a family, and people would like look at us and be like, "Oh, are they Polish people? What's going on there?" And it just like it always felt so special. But to me, it's always been this connecting thing that joins us together, and we have such a history as well within Wales of like the language being suppressed and stamped out by oppressors and people who wish to see it eradicated. And so I think it's important to uplift it and to talk about it as much as possible and to try and keep it alive. And I went through a period when I was a teenager where I didn't like the language because we were pretty much forced to speak it in school. There was like almost every Welsh person who grows up in a rural Welsh speaking area goes through a little bit of a rebellion where they're like, I'm not going to speak Welsh with my friends. I'm going to speak English like those people on television do. And our form of like rebelling against the powers that be. Because when you go to school, I remember I went to quite a strict school, which were like you weren't allowed to speak English in the classrooms, and you could have all sorts of like punishments for speaking English like to the teachers and things. And my dad as well, like I remember when I'd come home from school, if I started speaking English with my mum or my dad would get like really angry and be like, I don't speak that language, I don't know what you're talking about, like you need to speak our
Mhm.
language with us. So I went through a bit of a rebellion, but now I look back and I'm like, the reason they were so passionate about us speaking language is because of the history of like how
Mhm.
it's more or less died in so many regions, and so many people do not grow up with the privilege of knowing the language anymore. And I know that a lot of Welsh people struggle with that sense of identity because they're like, I remember speaking to one person who said they didn't feel like they could claim the title of Welsh because they don't speak the language. And I was like, but that's not your fault. You know, there's a history of why you don't speak the language, of
Mhm.
why it's not here. But yeah, I speak in the book about like the history of the language itself and how it connects to our people and our land, and also has like ties to all sorts of magical things. I think one of the comments I always get from people who are from outside Wales who talk to me is, Welsh sounds like a magical language. It sounds like a
Mhm.
language that dragons would speak or something. And I'm like, you know what? Historically speaking, it pretty much is, because we have ties to like ancient Brythonic languages that go back to some of the oldest languages in Europe. And then we also have ties to like ceremonial magical usage of the language. We have all these traditions of poetry, which are deeply rooted in the language itself and have influenced the formation of the language and the way in which we speak it. And the poetry that was influential on the language was utilized by bards that belonged to royalty, who could influence entire societies, entire communities, and entire like cultures in the areas. That's how powerful words were at one point in Welsh history. And I think that's a magic in and of itself. So I speak a lot about like the power of words and using spoken word within ritual and such, which I know some pagans don't like. So, some pagans like don't really jibe with the idea of like, oh, I don't really like, you know, like to use spoken word or incantation or rhyme within my spell work, but I do, because I feel like it's a tie to my culture and it's a tie back to the way in which our culture operates. I mean, in our national anthem, it says Gwlad Beirdd a Chantorion, a land of bards and singers. We're literally like a land that hoists up the idea of the arts and words and language and poetry. And we have like national Eisteddfods, which are celebrations of art and poetry and words and such. And it's just such an integral part of the culture that I think it needs to be part of the magic. And it also has ties to the magical traditions of Wales. And, you know, we have such ancient poetry, ancient prose, and also we have charms and spells, and they all seem to follow this bardic tone and tradition, which utilizes the way in which we put words together and how that can be powerful. So, yeah, that's kind of my connection to the language and how I see it as influential into my magical practice and spiritual practice as well. Words are very powerful things, I think.
Oh, I would agree with you. And it's so interesting to hear you talk because I'm just like, I'm just like melting into all of your words. We in our particular area of the States, we have a lot of people that we had sort of a diaspora from from Ireland, Scotland, Wales in this area. Most of the more English people are sort of more north, but especially in like the Carolinas and down into the southern states, we have so much of that. The language, of course, is gone, but a lot of our accent stems from these other cultures, and we're sort of looked down on a lot for our accent because we sound like hill folk and very country people. But that's sort of that remaining resonance that's coming from our ancestry. And when I hear you, and we have that, storyteller type thing, and we're a rural people for the most part. And so when I hear you talking about your connection with the land and your connection with the language and your connection with your people, like part of me is just like yearning for a connection like that, because my people were displaced, whether through their own choice or not. But we don't have a connection, a native connection beyond a few generations with this land, and the people who are native to this land have very different, well, not, I don't know, I would say very different types of practices. They are, but they're not. But we're also, that's not for us, because my people were absolutely horrible to the natives here. So what kind of advice would you have for people that are it's a two-part question, so I'm going to go with the first part first. So people that are interested in Welsh practices but don't have that physical connection to the land and the culture, whether they may have a genetic connection or not, what are your thoughts on that topic?
I, strangely enough, get asked this quite a lot lately, like how people from like across the sea who have some sort of ancestry can connect to it, and also like, do you need ancestry? Do you need like, some kind of tie, or can you just be drawn to it and appreciate it anyway, regardless? And is it like, I think one of the buzzwords that goes around nowadays is it an open practice or is it a closed practice? And I get asked that a lot, especially being on the TikTok side of things, because I make little TikTok videos. And I get asked a lot from like people who are now becoming aware of the conversation surrounding like closed practices and cultural appropriation. They're like, I don't want to appropriate Welsh practices. Like, are we welcome? Are we allowed? And I think the first thing I always say to that is absolutely. I think you're very much allowed into the culture and into the practices, especially because we were never like very gatekeepy about our culture, even though like we do have a history of people trying to smash the culture down and seeing us as lesser and such. We still were very open about sharing our culture no matter where we went in the world. So though like there's a big conversation to be had about like colonization and the reason why the Welsh like traveled and such, what I really like talking about a lot is how when the Welsh did travel to like America, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, they brought their culture with them and they shared it with the people that they came across, and they shared their songs, they shared their stories, and then eventually that became a whole new folk tradition. So it's almost like they were willing to share their culture so much. So I don't see why I shouldn't be today, like, or why anyone from Wales shouldn't be today. But one of the things that I always say is to be respectful of the culture itself as well, and seeing it as a living culture. I talk a lot about, in a lot of my work online and such, about how a lot of Celtic traditions and practices and cultures have been now homogenized, which I think is a bit of an issue. Like, we talk a lot about Celtic and not specifically about like, well, which Celtic culture.
Right, like it's one thing.
Yeah, and I think that's quite so like, to get on a little bit of a high horse for a second and
Go
like
ahead, you're
preachy,
welcome.
it's like by squishing all the cultures together and creating this one homogenized Celtic culture, it plays into that idea that is found in like really dangerous ideals and concepts within like white supremacy and stuff about like, oh, there's this white culture that exists and it's better and like more robust than other cultures. And I don't like that. So I like to instead focus on the smaller, like cultural signifiers and such. So rather than Celtic, I won't say Celtic much in my work. I try to say Welsh, or if I'm speaking about another culture, I'll say like Cornish, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, because
Mhm.
though we are all Celtic and we're all joined together and related in some way, we are also very vastly different, even to this day. And then another issue I come across a lot is the fairy taleization of the Celtic cultures. So it's this like notion that people look at the Celtic cultures as something of the past, as something that
Mhm.
is been and gone. Like, you know, it's centuries ago. It's like ancient world, like Brave by Pixar, like long, like red-haired people running through the woods on their horses with like bows and arrows, with
Mhm.
will-o'-the-wisps around them and fairies flying around them, and long like medieval corsets and such.
Is
And
it not like that? Wait a minute.
well, depends who you are. But it kind of it becomes a bit of a problem when like you talk to some people who have this like love and appreciation for all things Celtic, but then the more you talk to them, you realize, oh my, they have like a completely like Game of Thrones style view of
Mhm.
what it means to be Celtic. And I think that can like be almost like an erasure of the concept that we are still here, we're still living to this day. You know, there's still things going on within the Celtic nations that are relevant to the modern world. So like I was speaking to someone recently about the independence movements that are happening across like the Celtic nations, how Scotland, you know, is still fighting quite strongly for independence. Northern Ireland is talking about reunification with the Republic of Ireland. Wales has an independence movement, the Annibyniaeth movement. And even Cornwall, even people from Cornwall, like Cornwall, though it's technically classed as a part of England, they view themselves as very much their own place. They are a Celtic nation officially. And even there are whispers in Cornwall of the idea of Cornish independence from England. So it's almost like there are all these little political movements going on in the cultures today, and all these little things about, like, you know, how to raise our culture up from the subjugation that it's faced in the past, how to bring the languages back to a place where it's good and like spoken freely. Like Wales is doing really well with our language because we're almost at 1 million speakers now, and quite a large percentage of the population speaks Welsh as opposed to like 20 years ago. But like there's still a lot of work in other Celtic nations to bring languages back, and there's a lot of that going on. And I just hope that people who get into Celtic like movements when it comes to spirituality are also aware that it's a living culture, it's existing today, there are problems, there are things going on, and there are people living in those cultures today that are dealing with things that they like, you know, want to happen. And a lot of times when people talk about Celtic stuff, they don't know about all that. They only know about like the Mabinogi and the mythology, and that's fine. I think it's great to have an interest in mythology, but it gets a bit scary and like almost feels like we're being erased when like people seem to think that we're some fantasy land that doesn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
And I think the place where that becomes a problem is when people I claim the identity of being Celtic as well, because it's something that I've come across a lot where people over in America who have like ancestry, and not just America, I've seen it from like Australia, Canada, everywhere, where like people who have Welsh ancestry or Irish ancestry, they will quite outright say, I am Irish, I am Welsh. And I understand
Mhm.
the like complexity of like why that is. Like a lot of people are just literally searching for a sense of identity because they live on stolen land and they don't really feel like
Mhm.
they can connect to the land they're on. And so it's easier to say, I'm Welsh or I'm Irish, than to try and kind of be like, well, I have Welsh ancestry, but I currently live in like Anaheim, and I have also ancestry from like this side of the world. Yeah, so I understand why like it's easier to
Yeah.
kind of focus in and go, I'm Welsh, but it can get a bit problematic when. So recently there was a situation that I was brought into with a friend where there was this man who was like who was very much like proud of his Welsh identity and was saying I'm Welsh online, even though he'd never stepped foot in Wales and was not part of the culture. And usually I'm fine with that. I'm like, you know what? If you want to identify as Welsh, that's fine. But the reason this one stood out to me was because he would go onto the pages of people who live in like Wales or Ireland and who are like literally part of the culture today in the countries that still exist to this day, but who just happen to not be white. And he would be like,
Mm,
oh, I'm more Welsh than you because I'm white. And that's the
right.
culture of what it means to be Welsh. And I'm like, no,
Mm,
those people are living in that land and they are part of the
hmm
culture every day. And that's what it means to me to be Welsh or Irish or Scottish. It's living in the culture, partaking in the culture, and not anything to do with like ancestry or blood or DNA. And that's why I say as well that it doesn't really matter to have ancestry or DNA to partake in like the spiritual or magical aspects, because it's just a culture. So if you partake in the culture, if you learn the language, if you learn about our history, our mythology, our literature, if you learn about who we are as a people, then you're almost inviting yourself into the culture by doing that and starting to live it. And that's, I think, the in. How to get in is to learn as much as you can. But I know it can be difficult to connect to like the ideas of, because a lot of what we do spiritually is about connecting to the land, to the
mm,
landscape itself. And we work in a very like animistic approach to the land and the spirits of the land. And that can be, I'm sure, very difficult if like you live on a land where perhaps the spirits there are connected to a culture that is not your own, and culture that was pushed aside in favor of the people that came over and were your ancestors. And I always struggle with this one because my advice is always just go out and speak to the land and get to know the land. But it is kind of a complex topic, I'm sure. Like, how do you do that in a respectful manner without treading on toes of people who have been displaced as well?
Yes, and that kind of leads us to the second part of my question. Um, as someone who lives, on stolen land, and my ancestors were part of that thievery. Although some of them were here, some of them came later. Regardless, same thing. Um, Having a connection to the land that you're on, that you're living on, that you're eating from, that you're breathing the air from every day, you know, is not it's not specific to one culture or one people. And the nations that lived here previously roamed around and changed. There were so many nations. You think Native American and it's the same thing as what they do with Celtic. It's not one monolith. It's several different nations with very different cultures and very different traditions and different languages, and you know conflicts between them and alliances between different cultures. So there's not one. And that they changed hands, particularly the space where I am. It wasn't just one people for thousands of years. It changed hands, as one nation would take over another. So it's a complex topic. There's layers and layers of spirits and ancestors, that are tied to the land. And my family has been here for going back to the revolution, so that's a few generations, but very, very new. What advice do you have for people that are sort of displaced from their ancestral land to connect with the land that they're on, in a respectful way? I know for me, I just go talk to the spirits of the land because they were here before any people, you know and they seem to be receptive to that. Hopefully that's not just in my mind, but they're receptive if you approach with honor and respect, and recognize, like, you can't pretend that what has happened here hasn't happened, but you can try to repair those relationships. What would your advice be for displaced people, in connecting with the land they're on?
That would definitely be my first point of call, is to just connect with the land itself, is to go and speak to the land, speak to the trees, speak to the plants, get to know the plants and trees that grow in the region, get to know the flora, the fauna, the very ecology of the land that you live on, as well as like, the geology, and like, learn about like what rock structures grow, what plants grow, learning about these things and getting to know the land on quite an intimate level, and then going out into the land after you've learned it as well. It's not just all books, like very much like learn about it in books, then go out and experience it, go find these things, go learn about them, and understanding that the land is very much alive and teeming with life, or at least within my beliefs it is. The
Yeah.
land is full of spirit, and everything is very much its own spirit and its own, like, has its own identity. And so I would very much just say go out and first and foremost connect with the trees, connect with the rivers, the lakes, the shorelines, connect with the earth itself and everything around you in a respectful manner. Treat them as if you're, speaking to a very elderly grandparent who you want to treat with the utmost respect, and go forward in that manner and build those connections. But then one thing that I love to talk about lately is, especially because, as I said, I get this question quite a lot, because a lot of my audience nowadays are in America, and they talk a lot about, how do I connect? Because I'm from, my ancestry is from Wales, but now I live here. I always say, if you have ancestry from Wales, or any of the Celtic nations, or anywhere in Europe, really, and they have been in that area that you're living in for quite a long time, then it's very likely there's also some folklore in your region from those people. There are beliefs and folk practices in that region as well. So I've been reading a lot lately about Appalachian folklore and Appalachian folk beliefs. And it's always quite I don't know why it's shocking, but it is shocking when I see things and I'm like, oh, that's the same
That's
as what
this.
we
Yeah.
that's what we do. And there are little parallels and synchronicities. I remember reading about the Tommy knockers, or the knockers of the mines, the little goblins that live in the mines. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, we have Cobblenai, who are little mine goblins that live in the mines here. In Cornwall, they have the knockers. And then we also have a term in Wales, in Welsh, called knockars, which is the Welsh version of knockers. And so it's really interesting to read those folklores about these mining spirits that were so associated with one of the biggest trades that existed in this area, and how when they went over to the Appalachian region, and that was also one of the main trades that was going on, was going to work in the mines and such. They also had these spirits, and they also had the folklore surrounding them. So it's almost really interesting to me to find those connections between the legends and the folklore of the land, and how they intertwine with one another. And it's almost like an echo of a folk belief that has been carried over the sea and brought to this new place. And there's a lot to be said about is that okay? But at the same time, if they are talking about these things, they believed that these things existed in the land. And so they're there now. The spirit is there and alive. And it's something that we can also connect to if we are on faraway lands, is understanding that, though your ancestors are from thousands of miles away across the sea, they were also here, and they were also in this place that you are in now. And they brought their folklore, they brought their beliefs, they brought their traditions and practices with them. And so find as much as possible from that kind of place, from that area of study. Find as much as you can, and it'll tell you a lot about what your ancestors did, what the people of that area did, and how they interacted with the landscape when they arrived. And I think that can glean a lot of information on how one can connect to the land as well.
It's interesting that you were talking about people bringing their folklore and their stories and their spirits with them as they came over. And it's interesting to me. I'm curious, so I would have to have someone from your area come over here and then compare. But it's interesting because I wonder if those are sort of just, if they're recognizing spirits that are a certain type of spirit and then labeling it with a name that's familiar to them. They recognize a resonant between this type of spirit is the same as this type of spirit over there, and not necessarily bringing their own spirits, they're putting them in a case and bringing them over like American gods. But they recognize a resonance between this type of spirit. It reminds me of when the Romans came up and then they would just call things Mercury, that, they had a resonance. They had a similar energetic resonance to particular deities in that area, but it's not Mercury, but it's similar. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you think that they're actually bringing the spirits over with them? I guess it could be both. It doesn't have to be
think
one.
it's a bit of both. I think it's a mixture, because as somebody who talks a lot about fairies in my work, I talk a lot about the fae and fairies, because that is a popular topic, but also because it's so an integral part of my practice, because fairy faith and fairy folklore in this area that I'm in was such a huge thing for so many thousands of years. And so like I like to speak a lot about fairies, and talking about like things like goblins and those kind of strange, almost eldritch creatures that live in the forest and who are otherworldly in nature. I do tend to think that a lot of them is a case of perhaps the people moved over heard about a spirit or saw and experienced a spirit that was very similar to something that, you know, their parents and grandparents talked about when they were at home, and they just made that connection. Because what I always find interesting is there's always a variation in some way of like how they are perceived. So the going back to the knockers, the idea of these like in the mines, goblin like creatures in the mines. In Welsh folklore, the goblins, the Coblynau, they are completely benevolent. They are good. They are always good. They will always lead you to good things, to good ores and good minerals and rocks and such. And then they are also like a good sign. If you can hear the Coblynau working away in the mines, it's a sign there is good ore here. And so long as we leave offerings for them, and there's a lot of cultural traditions, such as like in Cornwall, they would eat the Cornish pasty and they would give the crust of the Cornish pasty as an offering to the Coblynau. And there's like similar traditions then in other mines in America like that. But I always found it interesting that there are also some like almost horror stories surrounding these goblin like creatures coming from like Appalachia and stuff, where I've heard that they're almost like terrifying in some ways. And it's like, oh, so that's like a strange like variation in the folklore there, that over here it was very much like these are good things, we give them offerings, it means that they're going to lead us to like riches and abundance. And then over there it's almost like a mixture. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them we need to stay away from, and they're an omen of like bad things happening. So it does tell me that there's almost like a regional identity that is different to what people were perceiving over here. So there's definitely, I think, a case of some of the spirits were just local regional spirits that people gave a name to because it's like, oh, these are similar to what we experienced back home, and now they're here as well. But then in other cases, I do think that because there's a lot of folklore surrounding like, oh, this family had a boggart or a bupach, like a brownie or something that they brought over with them, or a spirit that is like there's slightly darker tales where it's like this family was cursed with this like poltergeist who haunts them constantly, and even moving across the sea didn't stop the spirits from following them and such. So I think it's a mixture. I think it's like a mixture of almost three things, like the family ancestral ties to certain spirits being brought over, and then also because the people were moving over, maybe some spirits followed over, but also like the connection and correlation between new spirits that people were encountering. And I do wonder as well if there's a little bit of like, oh, the native people who lived on this land told us about this type of spirit, and that reminds us of this, so it must be that. And almost like this like mixture going on of different folklores and traditions. Because I think from what I've read, that had happened as well, where like almost some folklores and beliefs from certain tribes that lived in certain areas did also mix with the people who ended up taking over the land as well. So I think it's a mixture of all those things building up into this huge simmering cauldron and then culminating into that.
And that's sort of exactly what it feels like too. And we're such a blended, I know I'm talking about America a lot and your book's about what am I doing? You know, it's such a blended culture over here. We have so much culture that we have no culture. You know, it's so we have these little pockets of culture that almost always came from elsewhere, you know, and I think we're still such a baby country, you know, and I think we're just starting to really want to develop, because so much of coming to America was like, leave everything behind. You know, we're going to be this one people, we're going to be American, and that's going to be the thing that we are. But we had no idea of what does that even mean, you know? And I don't think we appreciated the importance of culture and community. You know, that's something that I feel is missing. And I feel that developing a witchcraft culture that we can all, you know, even if it's not the same culture for everyone, of course, but that we can all resonate and we can all have community together with, is one of my goals over here in the work that I'm doing. So I think it's absolutely beautiful that you have that connection with the land, connection with the language, with the people, with your ancestry from that same place, because we can learn so much from how that expresses in your community, in your connections with each other, and your connections with the spirits in the land as well. Um, yeah, so I just went on a tirade there. Sorry about that. So tell me, have you got are there more books in the works from you
Oh,
or
definitely.
in your mind?
There's a lot of things kind of culminating at the minute. I've got a lot of ideas, and it's just figuring out which one wants to come to life first. Because I tend to follow a very magical system of like following the Awen, as I say. And
Hmm.
the Awen is like the force of divine inspiration, and it's like a huge cultural thing in Wales to like pull the Awen, pull that deep divine inspiration from the other world into you. And so I always like it's not a very practical method of working, but I do tend to, instead of like, oh, I'm going to work on this and I'm only going to do that for the next 4 months, I tend to just go wherever that intuition and Awen is leading me. And at the minute, that means that I'm working on 3 different things at once. And so it's like, okay, can I please just focus on one thing and like get that done? But yes, I have plans. I mean, when I was writing this book, Welsh Witchcraft, I wrote it with the intention of this being a very introductory book, a very kind of like, you know, this is your doorway into, if you've never heard of Welsh witchcraft, if you've never heard of the magical traditions and cultures of Wales, this is a little gateway into it so that you can kind of get your first footing and find your way around it. And I remember when I was writing it, I created these exercises and such, and I was writing with the intention of some people who have never even heard of witchcraft in general, in a modern
Hmm.
sense, will also pick this book up. And that came from before I started like announcing that the book was coming. I remember I started gaining like a strange amount of followers on certain social media sites because I was talking about Welsh like cultural traditions and things, and people were really interested in it. But I was getting peoples from all sorts of walks of life. I was getting witches and pagans who were really like, oh my gosh, yes, this is my ancestry, or this is something that I'm really interested and intrigued by. I need to learn more. But I was also getting just Welsh people who wanted to know more about their own culture, who had no ties to witchcraft or paganism in a sense, but wanted to know more about the history of that kind of stuff going on, because it is really interesting and we're not really taught about the magical side of our culture in like school and such. I don't remember ever learning about like the folk magical traditions or things like that. We kind of stopped at the mythology. We did the literature, the Mabinogi, and then we moved on. And I really like wanted to try and push those aspects, the folklore and the folk magic, and a lot of people were really receptive to it. So I remember when I was writing it, I was like, okay, I need to keep in mind that not everyone will be a witch or a magician or an occultist when they are reading this book, so it needs to act almost like very introductory, and it acts as almost like an introduction to Welsh witchcraft, but also witchcraft in general. And I'm hoping that as I progress now and I write more books, that I can go deeper, like much deeper into like things that I've been exploring in my own practice and things that I want to talk about with the world as well. So yeah, I really hope there's going to be more books.
You know, and I have to say that even for experienced practitioners, this is a beautiful, uh, a beautiful look at Welsh witchcraft and witchcraft in general. I like your perspective on, you know, what is a witch? What are we doing here? Why do we do this? So I enjoyed it even not as a beginner. So I think it has value for absolutely everyone. So I don't want people to think, oh, it's just a beginner book. It's not. Go get it. um, what do you have? So this is a question that I like to ask people. Um, what is the future project? And it doesn't have to be in the works. It doesn't have to be, you know, it could be 20 years down the road. What is your big thing that you are most excited about doing, hopefully one day? It could be already in the works, but what's the big thing that you want to do?
So I really want to write quite a lot of books about different things, but specifically, I would love to write something that is a working, almost manual into crafting like magic in a Welsh sense. So almost like a huge tome of spells, charms, rituals, rites that are Welsh in nature, a mixture of, like modern practices that have been created by me and other Welsh witches that I've met, and also like how they tie into the historical magic. So though in this book I do talk about the practical aspects of Welsh witchery, I just want to go deeper, and I want to like really dig deep into those traditions and practices and create almost like a go-to guide of like, oh, you want to craft magic and you want to try and focus it in this kind of Celtic Welsh essence, you can go to this book. And I struggle with that because I don't know if it's reflective in the book, but in the book that I've already written, but I struggle with writing exercises and spells because I'm a very experiential person. Like I like to experience and do. So when I'm writing it, I'm like, what did I do again? I can't remember now. How did it feel? What did I do? And so like that's something that I really want to do, but it's scary in my eyes. And I just don't know if it's going to
Please
happen
do
anytime
it.
soon. Yeah,
Please
I
do
will.
it.
And
Oh,
then
good. Yay.
the other one that I really want to write that's like really like picking at my brain at the minute is a guide to like the fairy faith of Wales, the fairy folklore and beliefs of Wales, because it's a really interesting area of folklore and folk tradition in Wales, but it's such a misunderstood area as well because it's full of like there's Victorian influence which added a lot of twee and like romanticism to it, and then there's also like misunderstandings from fusing like I think because we're a Celtic nation and we are a Celtic people, people mix us up with other Celtic nations, such as like I think the fairy faith that people might know most about is probably the Irish fairy faith because it's been spoken about more in like modern paganism. And I struggle sometimes because people will bring beliefs that they have from like what they read in like books on Irish fairies, and they'll bring them into Welsh fairies and they'll think it's the same. And it's like really hard to like unpack that and be like, no, we are both Celtic, but we have our own unique like perspective of these things. And there's contradictions and variations and differences. And that's true not just between like Ireland and Wales, but also within different regions in Wales and Ireland themselves. Like, the beliefs surrounding what like this type of fairy is in like the northern part of Wales might be different to the south or might be different to the mid part, and it's the same in Ireland as well. And so I really want to write a book that's a deep dive into the fairies of Wales, as well as like a working manual for like should we and can we and how would we work with these spirits as witches, as practitioners, and how would that go about, and did it happen historically and such. So that's another one that I really want to, but again it's very kind of daunting and scary. So yeah, those are two projects that I'm kind of like, okay, this will happen one day. I just need to actually get over my fear of getting it right.
Oh, I hope that you do, especially the book on fairies, because there's so much misconceptions, just in general. And I would love to hear specifics from those different areas as well.
Yeah.
Yay! Thank you. So it's been absolutely wonderful chatting with you. I have so enjoyed having you on the show, and I do hope you come back. When your next book is ready to come out, please come back. Where can our listeners find you?
So I'm available like pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on TikTok, where I make these really flamboyant, over the top videos about folklore and magic. They're a bit wild and crazy. On YouTube, you find me more like toned down. I sit and I talk about things in depth on YouTube, whereas on TikTok it's very kind of theatrical and over the top. And then I also have like Instagram, Facebook, and I'm at Mhara Starling on all of them. I also have a Patreon, and my Patreon is still in the works, still kind of figuring it out because it's new to me, but my patrons get access to exclusive content that nobody else does. They get access to things like Discord servers and things like that, and also as we move into April, I will also be releasing my own podcast, the Welsh Witch Podcast, and that podcast will be like uploaded to my Patreon before anywhere else, as well as like full unedited versions versus like the edited version that I put out. So it's like a good time to join because I think I'm starting to get the hang of it now, and they do get access to like an exclusive video lesson every month and such. So yeah, if you want to support me and help me in all that I do, that's the place to go. So Patreon, and then also Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, everywhere.
Wonderful. That's so exciting. And we're gonna make sure and put links to all of your things in the show notes. And yeah, I think that's the show. Thank you. I've loved talking with you. Please come back again, everyone. Mhara Starling, who is the author of Welsh Witchcraft, A Guide to the Spirits, Lore, and Magic of Wales. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And blessed be, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe through your favorite podcast provider. It helps us get our podcast in front of more listeners just like you. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail by clicking the link in the description of this episode, and you can always find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for Crossroads and Cauldrons Podcast.